Hey, it's Amir Bormand, and this is another episode of the Daily 10 segment of the Talent Tango podcast with my brother Arash.
Hello.
So we wanted to talk about, well, actually last night, Arash had a pretty good conversation with a candidate, and we kind of, dug pretty hard and very persistent follow up by Arash to get a little bit more granular. Didn't end up helping the candidate, unfortunately.
Not this time.
But it is a good question that came up of how far do you go in terms of trying to make sure you have as much detail, and at what point do you stop, and at what point do you realize that more information doesn't help?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this particular case, the candidate had finished a technical interview. So those are always, to me, very appealing because I want to know what the client asked.
Absolutely.
The more we understand kind of what questions they asked, that it can help us on the front end if this candidate isn't the right fit. And so for me, I just shot him a quick text. Mind you, our communication has been pretty frequently on text rather than email or through the phone. So I chose the means of communication that we've been working with. And so I just dropped him a text and said, hey, how did the text screen go? And he said, yeah, I thought it went okay. And based on that, I was like, okay, like let's find out kind of what happened a little bit more. And then he said, yeah, I came up with the solution, but not the optimal solution that they were looking for. And I just asked him, hey, after the fact, did you come up with the right solution? Because a lot of times I think in these technical interviews, people sit back and they want to solve the problem because they're problem solvers, right? And he's like, yeah, I actually came up with the right solution. And so knowing the client, it's a technical role. I said, well, maybe it will be in everybody's best interest to send them the result of your answer, even though you got it after the call ended. He was like, okay, well, I just need to type that up. I'll email it to you. So I was like, great. I sent it over to the client. They appreciated it. It wasn't to still the standards of technicality that they wanted for the position, but that just touching base with him, the quick text led to this. And in this case, it didn't necessarily help us get to the next round of interviews, but there's definitely been cases where clients have come back and said, wow, thanks for, letting us know or whatever the case is.
Yeah, and I think really, when you look at it, making sure that you've done all the due diligence that you can possibly do in this situation, but also being able to push back onto the client. And that could be, the client, the customer, whether it's a, agency, internal, the manager, pushing back and challenging what their mindset is sometimes isn't always easy to succeed in. But if you have enough information, maybe it exposes something where they will look at something that they previously might have overlooked. I think that's where a lot of the consultative part of this job comes in. That's a little bit more challenging because you're obviously going to speak to somebody who's a domain expert, and you're taking some of the information that you've gathered and you're going back trying to shift their mind. But I do think in this case, at least there's a follow through. Maybe there's a different role down the road for this candidate, and maybe that puts him in good light. At least he was willing to follow through, and not everyone does. Some people are like, "Hey, I bombed it. I don't care. I'm out."
Yeah, I mean, obviously, to each their own, I guess. I think from my end, I like to be very thorough and really understand kind of how not only they thought the interview went from the candidate's perspective, but like kind of where they now assess that client, right? Because they might have interview activity. And I kind of want to know where I'm positioning them or where they have this client ranked versus their other opportunities. But more importantly, I also want to really know, like, what did you think? I always say it's a two-way street. So to me, as much as the client needs to like you, the candidate needs to like them as well. So I really want to know what that beat is. I think right after, it's like going to the movies, right? You watch a movie, you're like, that was the best movie ever. And then you kind of wait a couple days, and you're like, it wasn't maybe as good as I liked. So I do like to get that initial feedback because I think it's really raw and it's more fresh in somebody's head about who they met with, kind of what happened, and kind of get that initial reaction. And it's good sometimes so that the client know, like, hey, they're really excited. I think anybody, if you go on a date with somebody or even if you're interviewing, you want to know that this person was excited to meet you, the team, what their thoughts were. And those are good things to let your client know. And sometimes there's good tidbits that come out like, hey, I think we alluded this a couple episodes ago, like they didn't provide water or something like that. So if there's anything you can translate, I think just that dialogue and that reach out can really be powerful.
Yeah, and I think that's where, like, I think when you're internal or you're an external partner, I think it's your job to take as much back as you can, provide the feedback so that they also internally are aware. And it might be a calibration thing. So it might be
Yeah.
expectations. If this person isn't strong enough and you have multiple people at that level, then it is maybe a recalibration of, okay, at this compensation, at this level of experience, we're not going to get to somebody who's at that next level. And I think in the case of this candidate, you know, maybe a more mid-level role would have been a better fit. Who
Right.
knows? Maybe they would have graded him in the homework assignment. I mean, almost every single role that we're dealing with has some type of homework assignment, some type of quiz, some type of test, some type of exercise that you got to go through. And maybe if he would have been submitted at a mid-level range, maybe the assignment and the way they would have graded the curve would have been different. Maybe he would have been okay.
Right.
And that's the positioning up front. Obviously, it's a little bit difficult to know that before they go into the process, but being able to use that information and recalibrate, refactor the next search, I think helps both the internal and external teams.
Yeah, no, and I think it's fact gathering, right? The more you know, the more you have at your disposal and how you position those facts,
Sure.
depending on the circumstance, you apply that appropriately and applicably. But I think in this particular case, I think it's just good habit to get into the process of following up. I think a lot of times too many people are, sending people on interviews and then just waiting for the client to say yes or no. And that's good too. And it's good to also get the feedback from the client. Like, hey, how is this person? How did you think they interacted with the team? Things like that. These are a lot of like nuances that I think go past just the technical aspect. And as we know, hiring is just not purely based on technical attributes,
Sure.
right? It's about how do we like this person? How are they going to fit into our culture and our team and whatever the case is? So I think asking those follow-up questions, one, you also build a better rapport with your candidate, right? So I think that's part of it. And they understand what happened, right? Or you have a better understanding because you're not there, right? That's the tough thing as a recruiter. You're not in the room. Even internally, a lot of times you might conduct a part of the interview and maybe be even in a panel, but you're not in the all of the, interviews to really know kind of the nuts and bolts. And I know a lot of people gather around and do, huddles to make sure everybody's on the same page. But I think a lot of times enough outreach after interviews is not done.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was part of a Twitter discussion once, and the topic was, what if you have the entire interview process on site recorded? And the reason for that was obviously everyone could be able to review different parts of it or the whole thing to make sure that the feedback is matching for what actually happened.
There's no unbiased feedback
Well, I mean,
or
there's gonna be
bias.
bias, but at least this way, different people could view the same interview and see and make up their own minds for the pieces they weren't involved in. But in the case of when you have assignments that go back, we actually had an assignment where the developers needed close to I think what 5 days of time to work on it, and we had to go to the client and say, hey, listen, there's very few people that are willing to commit to an extra 15 to 20 hours of work for an
I
assignment.
agree.
Interestingly, the client didn't care. They basically said, "This is our process. If you don't want to finish, don't finish." So we had a massive dropout rate. We did end up placing quite a few people at the client, but they also probably missed out on some candidates that might have been stronger that just didn't see that process through. But again, process. You got to follow
Yeah,
what's been defined.
yeah, I think, to each their own how you want to go about interviewing potential candidates. I think it's particular to each organization and each maybe even to each team. I think as recruiters, we have a process and I think we follow it well. I think it's something that goes without being said and not done enough of is just again accumulating more information, finding out what happened so then you can better explain it to the next candidate or to the current candidate or even to the client because you cannot be you don't have any feedback to give if you're not getting it, right? So you got to make sure you find out some information first so then you can provide 2 cents. Otherwise, what are you really telling somebody?
Yeah, and I think even with the candidate, what's lost sometimes is getting more obviously as recruiters, most recruiters are granular while they want to build up the submission. And then as they're done with the process, there's a drop off. But I think if you get more granular post interview debriefs, that means you can better take a more accurate, more relevant, more interesting role to that person in the future as well.
Yeah, and it helps you help service that candidate, and it also helps you service the client. So overall, you're just gaining more information, which is always the name of the game.
Absolutely. That's it. So that's it for today's episode of the Daily 10. We'll be back again tomorrow. Leave us some feedback on wherever you're listening to this. Give us some insight. It's still early stages, and we want to make sure that we're hitting the mark. Appreciate it.
Bye.